Stephanie, thank you so much for being here today. I'm thrilled to go through the topic that we have prepared because it's something that a lot of the companies that we work with are striving towards, and that's going from being a privately held startup to reaching that point of an IPO and then going beyond. And there are very few people that have gone through that full journey, especially in revenue operations. And I'm just so excited to hear about the experience that you had, and for you to share some learnings and things you wish you knew during that process. But I think just to kick it off, would love to hear the story of where you were, how that process went, and then what changed, pre-ringing the bell, post-ringing the bell. What was different about your role, the company, and anything else about your day-to-day?
Yeah, great to meet you, Anthony. Thanks for having me on today. Excited to sort of talk about the topic. Yeah, a little bit about myself. I've sort of been in the RevOps world for about 10 years now, and this was sort of my first exit from what was obviously a pre-IPO to post-IPO company based in the sort of like digital ordering space. And a super exciting moment. I think a lot of us sort of strive for as you head into these really exciting companies who are just doing a lot of cutting edge things. Yeah, where was I? We were sort of in like the height of COVID, which was just an interesting time to sort of be going through this process as a company of about, I think we were about 300 or 400 at the time. And so, we to kind of back up a little bit, as these sort of things happen, internally we're sort of made aware that, this sort of coming up and things will be changing as an organization. But really, leading up to the event, all everybody was excited about was to go and pop champagn and meet at the stock exchange and just take lots of pictures.
That's what I would be
Um,
looking forward to. I would be like, yeah, I can't wait. Share it with my mom, the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was just, I think a lot of people were just really riding the high and getting prepared for sort of the work that was ahead. But we definitely reveled in the moment, the day of, masked and all, and just tried to kind of collaborate as a team and to celebrate the win. But I think in the revenue ops world, especially, so much of what we do is so business critical. And, while we are sort of behind the scenes in terms of celebrating all of our wins as a sales organization, obviously, I'd like to think of our remit as like really the backbone of a lot of, the really important pieces of how we, go to market as a sales organization, how we work through obviously all of our contracting and, by large strides, the entire quota cash process.
Hmm.
There's a lot there that really needed to be, scrutinized and enhanced and sort of leveled up. And so I think some of the changes sort of happened a little bit over time, I started, there were more phrases and more vernacular that we really had to kind of understand as a revenue organization. I kind of bucket these sort of into three kind of categories initially. And, three kind of key things that I kept hearing over and over as we were being introduced to auditors and, the implement process was, how are we going to evidence for this? How do we ensure that we are SOX compliant? And, what is our system of record? And there are these sort of key phrases you hear as you're kind of going through that process that as a revenue ops leader, you really need to kind of dive into and understand, well, the way that we operated as a startup. Well, we always think about, how do we scale this? What is this going to look like, in some sort of exit? The time is here. How do we really start to dig into that? I'd say those sorts of things were certainly top of mind and sort of came across pretty immediately in the weeks and months to follow.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. How much time did you have to prepare? Like, did you get 3 months, 6 months? Were you thinking something like this was going to happen in the next 12 months? And was there anything you had to do to just get prepped for the moment?
Yeah, I think there was definitely some discussion around, what this might look like and, rumblings here and there. I think some of the things that we sort of talked about from a roadmap perspective, from a system side was, how do we need to start thinking about data governance, right, as an initiative and a strategy. That certainly was
Mm.
something that had been floated a little bit before, we knew that we needed to go, through the IPO process and, evaluate again, like those systems of record. So there were a couple of tactical projects that we sort of needed to tackle and understand and sort of ideate on ahead of the IPO that definitely we benefited from. post IPO. And those sorts of things obviously include, how do you formalize your sort of data governance strategy? How do you ensure that, we're able to sort of automate so many of what is currently those manual processes today, right? How do we kind of think about what's living in your Google sheet or here or there and sort of optimize that systematically with, everything that's sort of out in the tech stack today? There was definitely a lot of discovery to do there as well.
Was there anything in particular that stood out where, hey, we have a very manual process and probably some risk in our data governance in this area of the business, and we really, really need to fine tune it? Was it like quoting? Was it measuring discounts? Was it calculating bookings or revenue? Like, was there an area where it's like, man, we have to figure this out and fill this gap?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there are certainly, and I think that's what's interesting about kind of going through this IPO process is it kind of brings up and highlights all of those sort of little areas or big areas, I should say, where sort of it's rife for improvement and efficiency. So I think you really, you certainly hit the nail on the head in terms of one really key component of what was our QTC process at the time. We didn't necessarily have a formal CPQ engine where we really understood the full life cycle of kind of how we actually go through, the quoting process, the discounting process, approvals, your signatures and signing process, as well as how we kind of recognize that on the finance side of things. So that was certainly a huge initiative that took us a little over a year to really formalize because, at the time, everything was quite manual. You've got folks through customer success, onboarding, out to finance who are kind of looking at these contracts manually, which, as you can imagine, can certainly be, quite laborious and something that's not optimal for obviously our sort of like human resources as well as, the systems that we use. So I think it certainly was an area that we really needed to mature and sort of began that evaluation quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it living in Sheets and you had to migrate it to like Salesforce CPQ or Deal Hub or some system like that?
Yeah, so everything was in Salesforce to an extent where we didn't have, formal controls around the products that we're using and the discounting rules that applied to those things. And so while again, we had sort of a systematic process in place, it was really one in which we could really needed to optimize, right? And so that's when we began the discussions around CPQ, understanding, how we actually we had advanced approval models, things like that, where just based on the complexity of our sales cycle in the business, we really just was necessary for us.
Yeah. Did you pick a particular tool? Was it Salesforce CPQ or something else? If you can share.
Yeah, so we did choose Salesforce CPQ. If you've been through one of those implementations, it's certainly
They're so much fun.
there's so much fun. And so, yeah, it was great. And the implementation partner that we chose is great. So yeah, all is well that ends well, but definitely a large lift.
Nice. Yeah, no, we've gone through quite a few of those. And it tends to be one of the bigger projects that we work on and engage on here at LeanScale. We work with anywhere from seed stage companies to pre-IPO. And usually around that like Series B, Series C time is when you really need to start formalizing that. One, for scale, but especially two, if you're preparing for some event like this. Was there anything formal that you had to go through before that moment? Any formal audit processes? Anything that was just something you had to go through before you went through the IPO process?
Yes, there were a couple things. And as you kind of get into the requirements around, SOX compliance, which for maybe listeners who might not be aware, is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which essentially, really the intention of this sort of compliance work is really just to, adhere to public companies ensuring that, we're mitigating fraud and understanding that financial reporting model in a pretty exhaustive perspective. So, we started to see a lot of, SOX compliance meetings pop up on the calendar and knowing that, we were
that had to be a giveaway, right?
Yeah,
Like, why
exactly.
are we going through SOX compliance if we're not going public just for fun?
Yeah. And so at that point, we became really, really close with the folks externally who were going to be helping us kind of work through how we articulate a lot of our internal process. which was a really, while it was exhaustive and painful at times, I think really landed us in a much better spot, especially from an operations perspective, because it really starts to highlight, again, the areas where, we really need to make an impact as we go into the IPO process. Kind of guides a little bit of our roadmap as we're thinking about post IPO. What do we need to work on first in terms of, is it permissioning? Is it, more stringent data pipelines between our systems? What does the reporting structure look like? Are we all speaking the same language in terms of the metrics that we're reporting? Are there nuances in the data that we need to be explained? And if there are nuances, how are we actually evidencing for those things? Is there a way to take nuance out of those sort of those processes overall? So, I think that was definitely an area where initially pre-IPO, we really needed to kind of go through that process. And again, while it can be, painful in the beginning, ultimately that should really, from a strategic perspective, guide your roadmap around, how do we make sure that, if we are a pre-IPO startup, how do we operate as a post-IPO organization and enterprise business? So.
Absolutely. No, I think if you can lay a lot of that groundwork ahead of time, one, it puts you in a position to even have that opportunity, because companies that are not operating like they're a post-IPO company likely will have a tough time getting there. So, the strategic advantages of getting the level of scale and just having the level of rigor on your data definitions will help make that process possible. What was the moment like? So it was during COVID time, so I don't know if you had an opportunity to pop champagne. I was head of RevOps during an exit that happened during COVID as well. I always envisioned the champagne popping moment, and I never even saw my colleagues again after that happened. So we never had that opportunity. But what was the moment like for you? Were you at home? Was there a meeting? Like, tell me about the story.
Yeah. It was a pretty fun moment. The company at the time was based in New York and at One World Trade, and so we were definitely those who were local to New York. We'd all kind of taken in this moment that ahead of the bell ringing, they kind of let you into this sort of like quote unquote virtual rating area, and you can kind of go and kind of celebrate together, and they kind of tee you up to kind of dial into the actual bell ringing. And the CEO at the was there and got really excited and obviously introduced the company. And we saw our huge logo all over the exchange, and that was just really great. And so at home with my husband at the time, and then, once we kind of got through, the bell ringing, we went down to the exchange and met up with, I think it must have been a dozen or so of my colleagues, and definitely had a champagne moment there and enjoyed ourselves. It was right around St. Patrick's Day, I think. So that was just a really nice moment for everybody. And I've got a couple pictures of us just all, masked up and just trying to, you can see our smiles through the masks. So, which was really nice. And those signs on the exchange are much bigger than you really think they are. Shipping those things out is just a whole to do. That was just a fun moment too, just like how momentous it was for everyone.
That is so cool. I know so many people in the startup world, like that's what they're striving for. And to just be able to go through that moment is so unique. What about after? So you pop the champagne, you have an amazing moment at the stock exchange. How did life change? How did revenue operations change? Or did it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back to sort of my points around the areas where, we really needed to up level the rigor around our systems and data. I think, if you think about the cornerstones of revenue operations as a whole, systems and tooling are really just one component of it. They're generally enablement somewhere in there. There's maybe some sort of compensation or commission. Maybe there's data. You can kind of slice and dice these growing revenue operations teams in a couple of different ways. But I think one area that we really leaned into, just by sheer necessity, was really understanding how our systems were able to really remain compliant and to level up to the degree at which like our processes were working as well. And so I think this kind of comes also back to, current business process pre-IPO is one thing, but then you think about post-IPO and how does that motion actually impact your internal processes day to day? While there's more compliance, there's more of that's happening and they're required of the business. it also can influence like how you actually adjust your internal business process, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
things may be working in one way, call it from the way that you actually quote your customers to who's made aware of that internally, how you do your onboarding handoff to CS, and ultimately how finance sort of ingests that and, works that through the rev rec process. You may have one motion there that is working or not working, but I think the IPO process in general sort of requires you to take a look at that and understand, well, while we may have to now evidence, right, and think about how we actually reflect what we're doing to somebody on paper and to validate, this external person can validate that we've actually adhered to the compliance requirements we've set up. Does it also impact the business process and how you adjust that moving forward? And so that was an interesting moving target, I think, as well, when we were kind of going through that process, saying, well, this is current state of the state today. Let's document all that. And let's hope that some third party can kind of understand and ingest that in a way that, makes sense to them as best they know our business. But then at the same time, it kind of takes you into a place of self-reflection, right? To say, is this the most optimal way to do this? How can we really make this better? And how can we, take some human error or a human element out of that? And we don't love our people, but that, we want to kind of take this off of them and be able to say, great, we're operating as an enterprise organization. How do we make sure that our processes kind of, reflect that?
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. Like not doing the audit just to check a box, but let's use that to actually enhance what we're doing. Were there any new like operating cadences, new reporting requirements that you didn't have before, new meetings you had to go to, anything like that happened post IPO?
Yeah, good question, Anthony. So yeah, as I mentioned, there was definitely a few more meetings on the calendar. We became quite familiar with some new folks internally who were really just in charge of, our actual internal auditing process, who we
Mm.
could work with our internal partners on. And they became just like inherent, cross collaborators, just like any others, as we're kind of going through, you know, the uh, the auditing process and auditing prep. So, we were doing, I think at that point we were operating on a monthly cadence. Actually, I think it was monthly and then it moved to quarterly cadence, for establishing like, who are your system admins? Like how were things changed? What does the change management process in Salesforce look like for you? How are you doing that? These are things where, we could hire one person just to go through the process of making sure that we can adhere to some of the requirements that we have. With Salesforce as an example, if you're a Salesforce admin, you're constantly making changes, ideally in Sandbox,
Ideally.
for you just had to plug that, and you're working through that process internally in Salesforce. And, Salesforce obviously is like, best of breed gold standard. They really helped us, obviously address any, compliance requirements and things like that. But, we had to think about, how do we formalize a bit of a change management process in Salesforce, and how do we evidence for, how you're actually deploying to production, who's doing that. And those were things that were iterated over time. We had to consistently be reporting on what were the changes that you made in the last month, the last quarter. How do we take a sample size of that and pressure test that against the system itself? So it's pretty exhaustive. And so there was, again, definitely that quarterly cadence around establishing, okay, what does system access look like at, at the most basic level? And then how do we kind of assess and pressure test change management? Because that's also obviously a key crux to, what we call our systems of record. And, kind of making sure that we're on top of those things. So they were certainly, quite familiar, with our process, and definitely something that we were doing, probably at the same cadence we were doing all hands. We were just needing to be that close to the process. And I'll say this too, I think for organizations that have been IPO for a decade or more, I can't necessarily speak to that, but I know that like in those, first few years that you've IPO, those are definitely things that are heavily scrutinized, and we need to kind of like work out those kinks in the beginning of things.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And I know, people are making investment decisions based on sales data, marketing data. So, making sure that is as accurate as possible and the processes make sense. It has a lot of implications.
Definitely.
If somebody is sitting in seat, they're head of RevOps, their company might be going public in the next 6, 12 months. What words of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Anthony. And I think the one thing that, well, one, it's so hard to sort of think about just one thing, but I would say, everybody talks about scale. Everybody thinks about, how can we, do this in a way that's not just going to get us through the next, like, 6 months to a year. But I think taking a hard look at the current state of the state in terms of how your specifically around systems works.
Hmm.
Think about what somebody coming into the organization who would be scrutinizing any sort of like risks or areas where there's a lot of manual intervention and things that are sort of needing to be uh, addressed by one person again, or a Google sheet somewhere. Think about how you strategize a way to like move that into an actual roadmap. Think about how you want to operate as an IPO'd company as a startup. And I think that's probably, maybe I'm trying to think of like an easier one hit way to say this.
No, I think
um,
that's it. I know there's a lot to it, so it's tough to boil it down to just a couple things, but
yeah. Yeah. Again, like the way that and this is me looking back on my experience is like, I go into my roles these days thinking about, okay, we're going to IPO, if that's our direction, no matter, or even whatever your exit you're looking at.
hmm.
Um, how do we think about the current processes, whether that's systems or otherwise, and imagine it under those pretenses, right? Imagine someone is coming in and saying, how do I know what changes you've made in Salesforce? Where do I go to look at that? Like at a very tactical level, right? I need to think about how we kind of present that in a way that makes sense while also like optimizing obviously your internal, business today, right? This isn't to say only focus on that area and that needs to be your guiding principle, but I certainly like that's how I go into sort of my new roles is understanding, okay, we know that we need to build this for scale. We also need to build this in a way that if somebody was going to come to the organization and say, hey, how do you do this? And if I've never worked here, I don't understand, how the data goes from one system to another. Where can I go to find that? And how do I know that that's accurate? And that we have controls around that, right?
Right, right. And a lot of people don't think about those type of controls. They're just moving, adding things in production,
Right.
lighting it up, throwing wrenches in the system every day. But
We're all wearing
no,
multiple hats.
no, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It's good for you to have that level of visibility too, because if there's turnover in the company, people can understand what's going on and pick up from where you left off. You can make sure you're building things efficiently. So I think, yeah, creating that evidence of how you do something, how a process gets completed, or having that change and control management, super important. So how did you go? I'd love to hear the story. None of these stories are usually super linear. But how did you end up being the head of RevOps in a company that went public, doing the type of work that you're doing today? How did that happen?
Yeah, let's take you all the way back.
Let's go to
so,
Genesis.
I'm currently coming into you from Santa Barbara, California. I was born and raised in Virginia, actually. So I'm a native
Hmm.
East Coaster. Love the Four Seasons and miss it dearly. But made my way out to California sort of in my elementary school years and was really raised in the coast of Monterey. And made my way down to Southern California for college. Really thought I would go, potentially into public relations or some other more communication space, sort of like, background and sort of area for my career. Quickly found that probably wasn't for me after being in LA for a number of years. Moved back to the Bay Area, actually. Got married and really wanted to kind of dive into the tech scene there. And found my way to my first startup, Revel, who does online ordering for all sorts of restaurant businesses and other verticals as well. Kind of came in as an initial actually in a sales role, and as you can imagine, when you're a smaller organization, no one's really owning sales operations. It wasn't even really something that I think the organization at the time had really thought, okay, we need somebody dedicated to doing this. And I sort of raised my hand and said, well, what's Salesforce and how do we actually go about formalizing a little bit of this, and kind of a shared responsibility among so many, as I'm sure lots of, folks in RevOps can attest to if you're working for smaller organizations. So moved from a direct sales role into a focused sales operations role there. And brought, what is now pretty like turnkey sales ops into my remit, and was with them for a number of years. Moved on to a cybersecurity organization, also based in San Francisco. Leveled up into a leadership role, which was great. completely in a different, obviously a different industry, but still in that SaaS model. And then people were definitely going remote, so moved out to New York City, where I found Olo, and that was just great. And that's really where I sunk my teeth into, really owning RevOps, kind of soup to nuts. Again, the first RevOps hire there, and worked really, really closely with sales leadership there on really just moving through that process, and formalizing a lot of that sort of remit at Olo. Was there a post IPO, and then just now recently found my new role, and again leader in sales, leader in RevOps, and looking to sort of grow a team. I definitely found my sort of cornerstone in sort of building. I think there's lots of different times in which in a RevOps capacity you can make an impact at a seed, Series A, Series B, public company. I think I'm a builder by nature, and so that's really where I found my new home, and I'm definitely really excited about it.
That's great. That's great. And I think probably having some of that sales experience right at the onset of the career helped build some empathy with what you're building. Because that's often how it happens. It's like, hey, I'm trying to do this job and I have some systems here, but they're not really working for me. And then the operationally minded folks end up saying, hey, can I help change this so I can do my job better? And it sounds like a similar trajectory happened too.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and I find that in the day-to-day, work that I do, I'm tapping so many of our sales leaders and also just our individual contributors just to give me feedback around kind of what we're thinking about. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a bottoms up or tops down approach to how we kind of work through a lot of things in RevOps. I get so much of great feedback and great value from obviously who are my actual customers, which is our sales team, marketing, CS, sort of the broader organization as a whole. I think it definitely, gives me just a really good sense of perspective and appreciation for the folks who are in seat.
I love it. I love it. Well, Stephanie, this has been really, really awesome. I was really interested to hear everything pre-IPO, post-IPO, what changed day to day, all the specifics. A lot of people are just working towards that moment, and what is it actually like? And I'm really happy, even though it was during COVID time, you got to pop some champagne with your friends and colleagues, because it's such a special moment. So taking time to celebrate is important. So yeah, just thank you so much for sharing that, and best of luck to everything you're doing now. Hopefully we get to see you ring the bell again. Let's see if we can make it happen a second time. And as you're going through, we'd love to have you back to share everything you've learned along the way.
Love it. Me too, Anthony. Thanks so much.
Thank you.